The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hi, my name is Joy Barrett. I'm the Executive Director with the Granite State Children's Alliance. We operate 5 child advocacy centers here in New Hampshire. And over the years, I've had the privilege of working with some really incredible organizations here in New Hampshire, and it just gives me a great privilege to be able to have this opportunity to talk to executive directors throughout the state about the work that they do. And I want to challenge all of you out there to really think of the word nonprofit in a different way when you start to learn about the organizations in our great state. We have great profits. We are empowering people. We're protecting children. We're preserving our environment. And so I want you to tune in to New Hampshire Cares and really learn a little bit about our nonprofit, our great state of New Hampshire, and the work that we do for people in our community. Hi, thank you for tuning into New Hampshire Cares. My name is Joy Barrett, and I have the pleasure of having with us today Betsy Hood from the Youth Council. She is the executive director there, and she and I were at a meeting earlier this week, and we just had to get together today to talk about this new quiz called What's Your Message? So Betsy, tell us a little bit about really the development of this and why you came up with it and what's it to kind of help us with in Nashua and some of the situations that we run into with alcohol and drug abuse.
Well, sure. The quiz was really designed to help parents understand how some of the messages they give to their kids can really help raise healthy children in this culture of alcohol and other drug problems. We read headlines constantly of young adults just making horrible life choices that wind up getting them into all kinds of consequences, leading down the road to needing treatment and recovery supports. Mm-hmm. And I wound up interviewing over 40 people over the summer, and so many folks that I talked to said, you got to get to the parents, you got to get to them while the kids are little, on and on, you got to get to the parents. Mm-hmm. And so that was sort of how the quiz came about.
So somewhat of a prevention campaign, so to speak, in some ways, to be able to have people really have some awareness about their own practices in their homes, let's say, and how that really translates to some of the problems we're seeing kind of down the road, is what you're saying, right?
Well, absolutely. And I think anybody out there that has a young child, they mimic what we do. Mm-hmm. I remember my own daughter watching her tuck her stuffed animals into bed at night and things like that, and it really was sort of exactly how I behaved. And so I, with a group of colleagues, came up with 15 questions mm-hmm. that we want people to ask themselves. There's no judgment involved, but really around raising awareness about how their sort of attitudes and life choices can really help or perhaps get in the way of raising healthy kids.
Wow, it's really terrific. And again, I saw it for the very first time at that meeting on Monday, and I thought, what I really liked about it, especially as a parent, was that the questions were very kind of simple for me to quickly come up with an answer, knowing mm-hmm. my own behaviors, my own habits, my own practices in my home. And, again, kind of that awareness of those different pieces and those practices and how they might translate into the behaviors of my children. And, I'm happy to say that I scored well. So I'm going to give myself a thumbs up.
Awesome.
But and I know that with limited time, we want to get right to some of the questions so that we can really have our viewers start to kind of follow along and maybe take the quiz with us today, if that's okay with you.
Sounds great.
So I guess before we start some of the questions, I noticed that there's the rating of often, sometimes, and rarely, and I love that they're kind of in traffic signals, which I think correlates to. Does it correlate to danger versus safe versus caution, or was it just really to color code them?
I think it really is that if you're on that sort of path of green light, that means you're setting good limits with kids, you're being firm and clear and consistent. And I think as folks head into the red zone, it's really more about, put the brakes on. It might be that your child is already on a path that could be pretty self-destructive, and that would really be a time to reach out, talk with a friend, talk with a trusted professional. Even starting with a faith community or a primary care provider, a school guidance counselor. Like, there's a lot of folks that people can talk to and shouldn't be ashamed. As we get into the quiz, we'll talk a little bit about what they call genetic predisposition.
Sure.
But some kids biologically are more likely to become dependent on substances than others, and substance use disorder is an official disease, just like diabetes or heart disease. So we don't want people to feel ashamed and be willing to reach out and get the help they need so they can get that support before things wind up going down a
Sure.
path that there's no point of return.
Sure, that's terrific. And again, to the point of when you take the quiz and the 15 questions, you're kind of given an overall rating, which is always nice. But what I liked as well was that each question, obviously you're rating yourself on that. So my favorite quote is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And if you're doing things that generally are okay, but there are a couple of questions where you find that you're in a zone that, maybe you can make some improvements on, or at least be a little bit more conscientious. It's those small little changes that you can make that really end up in the long term really making a big difference and being able to
Absolutely.
tackle that. So the
Absolutely.
first question is, how often do you open a beer or a bottle of wine when you get home from work? Now, I'm not going to comment on that one.
And I have all kinds of friends that post messages on Facebook, they can't wait to get home. It's
Sure.
Wine Down Wednesday and stuff that's really fun. But the crazy part is if that's the first thing that our kids see when we walk in the door, they think that you need alcohol to relax. And so the quiz is really encouraging people to exercise a little or meditate or just have a little bit of playtime with your child first. And then if you're interested in having a beer or a glass of wine, go for it. But it's the automatic,
Right. It's-
walk in the door, hi honey,
Put your
I'm
bag
home.
down and go.
Right.
Yeah.
That is sending a message.
Sure.
No matter how old the kids are.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see where that would, like tucking the doll or stuffed animal into bed, it becomes something that is the norm
Exactly.
of what you're supposed to do.
Exactly.
Number 2, is there someone in your family, parent, grandparent, or sibling, who struggles with addiction?
And that's what I'd said earlier, that it's a term called genetic predisposition, that if there is a history in your family, it means that our offspring are more biologically susceptible to becoming addicted. And it's critically important for kids to understand that. And one of the folks that I met with is actually a local Catholic priest, and he said, parents, as humbling as it is, you got to sit down and let your kids know if you've had an issue yourself or your own parent, because it's a huge risk factor for your child. So even if a kid thinks, oh, not a big deal, I'm not drinking that much, their body is processing it differently than the kid who might be sitting right next to them.
Right, like anything else, they should know what potentially could be a problem for them, and they need to be self-aware of really those circumstances.
Exactly.
Number 3, do you insist that your children under age 16 wear a bike helmet and under 18 wear a seatbelt? Now, that's a very interesting question that you might tuck into this, especially as number 3. And that's probably another good question to ask you with this. Was there a lot of discussion around order of these questions?
Well, let me respond to the bike helmet
Okay.
and seatbelt one first, and then talk about the order. There is a link. It's through national studies where there's a correlation between parents who make their kids wear bike helmets and kids who don't drink under the age of 21.
Really?
So it's really about parents talking about safety and setting rules and guidelines and following laws, that those kids are far less likely to engage in high-risk behavior as they get older. I think the order of the questions, I got a
Yeah.
lot of feedback. I vetted this with over 80 colleagues all around the state, just trying to get some feedback and input and make sure that it didn't come across as judgmental, because that wasn't my goal. But really the order we wanted to get people's attention early, but then also ease them in slowly, because some of the questions will get a little bit more complicated or challenging as we go on.
Okay.
So
Well,
there's a
that's-
method to my
So
madness.
well, and I knew there would be, but it was funny when I saw that question, I thought to ask. So number 4 is, how often do your kids feel powerful and successful?
You know, and I thought that was such a great question because I met with a group of young men in recovery. They
Really?
were
Wow.
all under age 25, most of whom were in recovery from heroin. And what they told me is that it's critical for kids to feel like they have some sense of control over their lives. There's so many adults that are, telling them what to do, instructing them in school, and that anything that they can do that feels like it's them making a choice and doing some of those
Empowering them.
exciting things. Exactly. And so ideas like taking your kids hiking, taking them mountain biking, doing some cool things to really help them feel adult-like, that they may not need to then turn to substances to get that sort of high-risk rush.
Sure. Well, that probably feeds a little bit into their ability to not have some peer pressure because they feel empowered, because they feel successful, so they're able to say no to some of those pressures that we know exist, kids have
Exactly,
in their
because
lives.
they'd have that much more confidence.
Sure.
For
Oh, that's
sure.
great. Number 5, do you use teachable moments? I liked this one in particular.
Well, and it's funny because there's all kinds of tools out there that say, oh, talk to your kids about alcohol or other drugs, but nobody ever kind of tells you what to say.
Or when to say it.
And when my daughter was growing up, we would sit and watch like dumb reality TV and would just have running conversations like, oh my gosh, like look at them. Like, would you actually ever do that? Or, they're not making good decisions, or, getting her feedback and things. And so parents can use any opportunity that comes their way to be able to just be clear. And I think that that's much less awkward than saying, Joy, it's time we sat down and had the talk.
Right.
And you'll both be just, mortified beyond belief, and nobody's actually going to hear what you have to say. A recent statistic that I read from a local community, I think it was like 96% of the parents said they had a good talk with their child in the last year around alcohol and other drug use. Only 38% of the kids of those parents said they had a good talk with their parent.
Oh, really?
So parents are thinking they're getting the message across. Kids aren't either hearing it or retaining it. And so it's really about just have ongoing
Regular,
communication.
right.
You hear something on the news about, somebody who robbed a bank and, did something ridiculous because they were under the influence. Talk about it.
Well, even what's going on with heroin now, I mean, it's a regular on the news how many overdoses there were, and
Scary.
unfortunately, we have a lot of teachable moments that might not be real personal to us, but like you said, consistency and constantly keeping that as an open conversation will resonate, better than thinking that you're going to sit down and have a conversation and you're done.
Right.
It's not one and done with this
Well,
particular topic.
And the tough part with the current heroin epidemic, too, is it crosses all
Yeah.
racial and ethnic lines, income levels. So a lot of people want to think, oh, that's somebody else. That won't ever be my child, or it won't ever be me. And, it really comes very close to home.
Yeah, it really does. And we have about a minute left, so we'll get through number 6, and that is, are you on speaking terms with your teen's co-parent?
And that's really a big one because there's a
would
lot
bet.
of families that are single parenting, or maybe a step parent team. And it's so easy, especially if your kids are smart, to learn how to play one parent off the other one. And so it's critically important that even if you don't have a great relationship with that co-parent, get somebody that you guys both trust to kind of mediate, set
Yeah.
some ground rules.
Yeah.
Because it's great having smart kids, but when they use it against you, it becomes a problem.
Absolutely. And, at the very least, if that can be kind of some neutral ground with, your co-parent to be able to rally around the issue, I think it's really important. So I want to come back on number 7 after we take a short break. Again, Betsy, it's so great to have you here. So we'll be back in a few minutes to New Hampshire Cares, and I'm with Betsy Hood from the Youth Council. Thank you for coming back to New Hampshire Cares. My guest today is Betsy Hood from the Youth Council, and we are taking the What's Your Message quiz that she and 80 colleagues of yours really developed. We got through question number 6 in the beginning of the break, and we're on question number 7. And again, learning quite a lot. And I hope you're keeping track on TV and taking the quiz along with us, although we're going to show you how you can get these questions so that people can take them on their home, at home and kind of get moving with them. But number 7 is, how many events do you host or attend that include alcohol or drugs to add to the fun?
And again, it's back to sort of the first question about just the culture. Can kids learn that you can have fun without winding up, opening up a beer, having a glass of wine, or in some cases, people using drugs. So you can have a pool night, a movie night, a family outing, or something where alcohol isn't always involved. And that's just a great message for kids.
Great message for kids. Number 8, do you get accused of being embarrassing?
That's really one of
That's
my
a hard
favorite.
one.
Yeah, because I think part of a parent's job is to embarrass their kids. And in this way, it's not meant about embarrassing because your behavior's so bad, but it's really embarrassing because you're going to go that extra mile if your child's invited to a party, that you pick up the phone and check in with the other parent, to make sure that they're actually going to be home and that they will be actively supervising the party. What's so tough nowadays is if kids are found at parties where there's alcohol or where there's drugs, or for those kids who wind up having an arrest because of drugs, can't serve in the military nowadays because it's so competitive that the military just won't take them. May or may not need to report a juvenile record on college financial aid applications. So it's really such a huge risk. So we tell
There are
parents,
consequences, yeah?
yeah, just get over it and make the call. Like, so what if your kid thinks you're embarrassing?
Right.
Be proud.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think, I used to always say to my kids, it's only because I love you that I'm doing those things, and
Exactly.
so it kind of
Someday you'll
lessens it.
thank me.
That's right. Someday you'll do the same thing.
Right.
So number 9, has your child proved that he or she is trustworthy?
See, and what I always tell folks is it takes forever to build trust, a really long time, but you can lose it with one bad decision.
Absolutely.
And it's just really important for parents to both figure out, can I trust my child? But if my child does something to lose trust, because part of growing up is also making mistakes, how can they earn it back? And so some families will wind up having contracts that both parties sign, and it's really trying to figure out, how do you define trust for your family, and how do you know when you've blown it? And it's also important to know that trust goes both ways, because our kids also look to us to be trustworthy, and if we're not being completely honest with them, or we're hiding some of our own behaviors that may not be the best choices, they're going to see right through that too.
Right. You can't be do what I say, not what I do. Right?
Exactly.
You really have to. Everybody has to be accountable. Number 10, are you an easy target?
And I think for folks that may tend to be a little bit more trusting, or perhaps a little bit naive, one of my colleagues who's in recovery said, when people are heavily into using substances and just aren't thinking clearly, it's basically that the substance has taken over their brain. So they will do anything and everything they can to get their next high. So people need to lock up their medication. The National Prevention Coalition is doing their huge Lock It Up campaign. There's a prescription drop box right in the National Police Department lobby, and there's also one in Merrimack and some other local communities. So get rid of medication you don't need, lock your alcohol, lock up your prescriptions, and it's okay to feel suspicious. Keep the communication open, but make sure you're being really careful
Taking
and
those
cautious.
precautions.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Number 11, do you talk yourself out of being worried?
I think it's tough as a parent because you don't really know what's normal developmentally. If my child's really withdrawn and kind of moody or things, is it because that's normal? Is it because they're may have an issue, like a mental health issue around depression or other things, or could they be using substances? And I know at the Youth Council, we do a lot of early intervention and assessments and education for kids who are experimenting with substances. But so often, before the parent would actually bring the child to us, their needs are so great that we have to refer them to a more
Right.
high intensity program. So it's really, don't talk yourself out of being worried.
Right.
You know, maybe nobody
Use your
wants
gut,
to come to
right?
your house because they're out drinking and they don't want to be caught and things. So really, you know, talk with folks. There's some great support groups people can go to kind of get ideas and advice to know if they really should be worried.
That's great, great advice. Number 12, do your actions reflect your values?
And that's really ties back into what you were saying earlier about, you know, walking the talk.
Right.
But it's so important for parents to have clear rules. Locally, only 77% of teens said their parents had really clear rules.
Really?
And, you know, I know folks who think, oh, it's no problem. I'll just take the keys. The kids can drink at my house. At least they'll be safe that way. But if you're encouraging any child under 21 to drink alcohol, or not even encouraging, but sort of allowing or tolerating, you're helping them break the law. You know, the New Hampshire has a social host law. There's really stiff consequences for that. And I think it's just really important to you know, set that standard and expect your kids to abide by it too.
Yeah, and you know, kind of to that point, you know, I think sometimes we decide to be good parents when it's easy to be, like when it's convenient for us to be, but then when it's maybe not as convenient, we break that rule a little bit because it just is, well, I won't worry about it tonight, or I won't, you know, that will impact maybe something that I want to do instead of, and I think it's important to be consistent with those rules. I think that sends the message of your value too, you know, making sure there's consistency and you're following up with that.
Well, and I know there was one website that had really talked about how do you throw a safe party. And one of them was that you don't allow kids to bring any liquid whatsoever into your house because they may be putting alcohol in water bottles or, you know, mixing it with other things. And that so anything that is consumed on your property is what you purchased yourself. And people need to be out and about and circulating. Don't just go hide upstairs and
Right.
leave your kids free reign, and to really be fully
Be
present.
right, supervise. Number 13, are you part of a faith community or other networks to lend support when times get tough?
You know, everybody's working so hard nowadays, and that it's really easy to become isolated. And some of the young guys that I talked to in recovery said that it was just so important, especially for them as a youngster, to know who can you go to, who can you count on. Another person I talked to as a guidance counselor said kids need to know who their helpers are early on. So I think at the young, you know, kindergarten, first grade age is really who are your helpers, and help them identify those people so they can then continue staying connected
Sure.
as the kids get older.
When you were talking to those in recovery, did they tend to share with you a common thread amongst their stories that were kind of the tipping point for them where they knew they were in trouble, or what got them into trouble? Was there any one particular thing, or was it really varied amongst the group?
Well, one of the things that I asked them, and it really ties into the next question,
Oh, it does. Okay.
is what do you wish your parents had done differently? And they said they wish they'd had more consequences as a child. To be out at a, you know, family reunion or gathering, and they're, you know, 15 years old and drinking, and they're like, oh, hey, cousin Harry, you know, that was us when we were kids, haha, you know, that people thinking that it's okay or that it's funny
Sure.
and that it's just part of that family culture, didn't realize it was wrong. And for those kids would start with alcohol but then wind up escalating, and today the huge issue is prescription drug use.
Sure.
Because that's really the precursor to kids trying heroin.
Is it really? Yeah.
So I feel like that really ties into
So yeah, number
that
14
question.
was or is, are you tempted to look the other way? So again, your idea about, you know, again, that question that you asked them, and they wish their parents had been a little more, had a little more on the reins of having rules and boundaries around those, you know, around drinking and all that.
And that does tie back into what you were sharing earlier about parents who think they're being helpful by being permissive. And there's so many correlations in the data that show that parents who are really clear about their rules and limits with their kids, those kids are far less likely to drink or use drugs than parents that are kind of wishy-washy. So it's really be clear and make sure you communicate that to
Right.
your
Make
child.
sure your kids know where you stand.
Right.
You know, where you stand on that.
Right.
And the last question, number 15, are you falling prey to guilt and shame?
And I think that really ties back into what we were talking about earlier and the stigma of drug use, and that it's not just a phase. It may not go away on its own. And how do you get out of that crazy cycle of just enabling over and over again? And if you have a sense that your child may be stealing money from you, or using the car as a privilege, one of my colleagues said that people need to get more misery than pleasure out of their substance use in order to change their behavior. And that's really at
That's a
the
good
early
point.
stage, before their body really winds up becoming addicted and needing some sort of heavy duty treatment. But as long as we just are embarrassed about it or don't want to reach out for help, the pattern isn't going to change.
Right.
And so it's really about reaching out. There's a phenomenal group called FASTER. I believe it's Families Advocating Substance Treatment Education and Recovery. And they meet twice a month at St. Joe's Hospital right here in
wow.
Nashua. And it's facilitated by parents who have been through it for parents that are struggling with it. And
Oh,
so
what a great network.
phenomenal,
Yeah.
phenomenal resource. And they are really a great go-to place.
Wow. That's awesome. So the 15 questions, one of my questions for you, were there more than 15 and you decided to pull some out, or did you probably find yourself kind of tucking them in and categorizing them to come up with these 15? And
I think the process was really organic and fluid. It was really to take all the information I gleaned over, 44 interviews, and just honing it down to what were some of those key things? What are really some of the simple things that we do as parents that we don't even realize in terms of the messages that we're sending?
Right.
So,
Well, very, very well done. Now, how
you.
can our audience get either, because this is what it looks like, which is terrific. And again, it's a very simple, the questions with then the explanation as to what that means below it. Very easy to kind of score, again, individually, but as the grouping of the 15. Where can people get a copy of this? I know that they'll be seeing it on the screen as we're discussing it, but where can they get a copy?
Well, at this moment, the very first copy is being printed.
Great.
So they are
Cutting
just
edge.
ready to roll out.
Excellent.
October 23rd launches Red Ribbon Week in the community, so I would love to have them available in and around Greater Nashua starting October 23rd.
Sure.
I hope to get it uploaded onto the Youth Council website, which is theyouthcouncil.org. And I imagine it will also be connected to the Nashua Prevention Coalition website, which is nashuacares.org.
Oh, perfect. Well, Betsy, as always, thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to New Hampshire Cares. Make sure you get yourself a copy of the What's Your Message. And until next time, thanks so much and have a wonderful day.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.